we should start. I was asked to be prompt on time and to finish on time. So we do have almost 1.5 hours for a discussion. We are competing with 6 another panels in exactly the same time. So thank you very much to all of you who came to listen and to take also an active part in the discussion on the subject of the external factors in the transitional processes. This is something what we, I would say, the Czechs know personally. When we were struggling in the dictatorship in the 80s to get the free society, the Czechs, also the Poles, the Hungarians and others, could enjoy a lot of support from abroad, from the West. So we do appreciate the role of the external factors based on the lesson learned personally. Since that, more than 20 years has passed. A lot of transitions we could watch, observe, or even take an active part worldwide. Some were more successful, some were less successful. So it's certainly the right time to assess where we are, let's say, 20, 30 years after. Some call this support, assistance. Dictators, they use different terminology, so they are frequently speaking about the interference into domestic affairs. Certainly, it makes a sense to discuss the external role, support, or interference, if you wish, both in the process which let's say, initiated the transitional processes, so before the external role, before the major change. But we should also assess what's gonna to happen after the change, where usually the societies are pretty fragile and needs the pro-democratic, pro-market and pro-civic society support, assistance, both in the terms of resources as well as in the term of the know-how. So the questions to be answered here, I would say the 3 important questions where I would ask our panelists to try to respond. First, where we are now, who are the current main players in the transitional support field, and what has changed in the course of the past 20 or even 30 years. Secondly, there is an issue of efficiency. In particular, I would be, and I hope you as well, interested, what is your, because you are all involved in that business for a pretty long time, so what kind of a support you value as the real efficient one? What should be the division of labor between the role of the government and the role of the NGOs? And last but not least, the third questions, where are the risks? Usually, you know, there is this law of unintended consequences. So many agents, actors want to play a positive role, want to help, want to assist, but in particular in different societies outside of, let's say, the Western world, have a different experience and different approach to accepting or listening to those well-intended advices. So are there any risks? Do we have already some lessons from the Arab world in the last couple of years? So those are the three areas where I expect we should concentrate. I want to thank Jakub Klepal and his team for selecting the panelists, because I think they were really happy bringing the best qualified persons to advise us. I will introduce step by step, so we'll start with a woman, of course. Barbara Haig. We know each other, for 25 years. Is a Mrs. NED, I would say, I guess that this nice daughter of well-known State Secretary of the Reagan administration, Alexander Haig, Barbara, she is engaged with National Endowment for Democracy since the middle of 80s. She was working hard. When Alexander Haig was a Secretary of State, it was Polish Solidarność who was on the rise. And then NED was the organization, together with AFL, CIO, and others, under the leadership of Lenkier clan, who has helped Polish Solidarity when she had to go to the underground after the coup. And then I remember when Václav Havel was elected the president, he was approached, me too, and the young guys around him, by the longtime president of NED, Karl Gershman, and Barbara. You should go to Nicaragua to support Violeta Chamorro, because it was the time when she was democratically elected after the years of the Ortega dictatorship. So among the obscures trip by Václav Havel in the first year of his presidency, we included Nicaragua as, since that, you are active everywhere, from Middle East to Latin America, from Eastern Europe to South Africa. So, Barbara, where we are now.
Thank you. Let me see if I can. Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Sasha, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be here with you and my colleagues and my longtime colleague, Ken Wollack. I'm feeling real nostalgia when you ask to reflect a little bit on where we've come. Where we started was really in the Philippines, and Ken was very active in the early transition in the Philippines. We moved to Chile. Chile is a good story. Now you've mentioned Nicaragua, which really makes me want to cry, because there was a successful transition in the short term, but it really hasn't turned out to be much of a transition in the long term, and this is something I think we're seeing more and more. So in the early years of our support for solidarity, support in Central Europe, you will remember that there really wasn't, in the way of financial assistance, real financial assistance coming from foreign governments. There was little bits of support filtering in from private sources and from NED, and it was really the local people who who shaped and drove the agenda. We were simply a support system for what people inside were strategizing, the tactics they used, and they were totally empowered to shape the agenda and to carry out their own negotiations. That's one thing that I think has really changed in the world of democracy assistance. Once the transitions were full-fledged underway, however, all the international governments came in to try to support, which was really necessary and important, I think you would agree. And much that was done was really, really helpful. But I would still maintain that the governmental support tended to be sort of focused very much on political processes and very short-term goals. And the longer-term work of sort of developing and consolidating the indigenous capacity to strategize, the civil society component, the political party component of the long-term work of developing policies for new governments, for monitoring the transition process of institutions and of political leaders, all of that sort of long-term work, educating the society, linking the society to decision-making. A lot of that was supported through private foundations. Some of that longer-term, more patient work took place with private assistance, and I think that's an interesting couple of points to keep in mind as we look forward. Where we are today, and I would just really fast forward to sort of the Arab uprising, the Burma transition, and so on. And also I can think of post-conflict. In Africa, for instance, we've done a lot of work in post-conflict. And as we move the discussion on, I want to go back to some of the issues that I've just laid out and talk about how they're implemented now.
Okay, thank you very much. National Endowment for Democracy is the U.S. foundation, which was established by Congress, if I'm not wrong. Not exactly. What is the correct information?
All right. So NED was first incorporated as a private organization. It actually reflected the initiative of people in the Congress, people in the private sector, and also people in government who for years were looking for some way to support democracy. So we were set up totally privately. But then the Congress very quickly approved funding for us, an authorization. So we do get annual funding, but it's a little bit, one came first.
Yes, thank you for the correct information. It brings me to our second speaker today, and that will be our Polish friend. There is a European Endowment for Democracy. I remember in 2009 when I was engaged with the European affairs during the Czech presidency. We had a lot of talks in the European Parliament, in particular with Radek Sikorski, the Polish, long-serving Polish foreign minister, some MEPs from the Czech group. Jana Hybášková was pretty active. And there was one intention to find the inspiration with the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States, something what was established, as we have heard now, by the private institution and the governments, and then later on supported by the Congress. Finally, this dream has turned into a reality. I understand because, you know, I was a defense minister in the last couple of years, so it has disappeared from my radar screen a little bit. But I checked the website of European Endowment for Democracy and got to know that this year is the first year, and it's the beginning. I think it's logical that the boss or chief of this European Endowment of Democracy comes from Warsaw, from Poland, because Polish were very active, in particular Radek Sikorski. So Jerzy Pomianowski is a long-time serving Polish diplomat. He was the ambassador in Japan. His usage, he started with the underground movement, so certainly a very well-qualified person. So, Jerzy, where we are now with the European Endowment for Democracy, in particular, what we can expect in future, something similar compared with these grand results of National Endowment for Democracy?
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you very much for invitation to be here in the forum. This is a wonderful place, and the forum itself is an important platform for international debate for so many years. And I'm very happy to be here, and especially to be here joining the group of so distinguished panelists. You rightly point that the European Endowment for Democracy, the name is not accidentally chosen. It was deliberately copying a name of National Endowment for Democracy, because when Radek Sikorski proposed to create one, he was not operating in vacuum. There was already for some time debate that there are elements in the European infrastructure of support to democracy that are missing. And definitely we were missing some flexible, not directly attached to government's policies, mechanism that can be applied quickly and effectively when needs comes. And with every politician, if you just have a good idea, it's not enough. You are a good politician when you are able to create idea when time is right. And it was right time. It was just after the collapse of a promise of democratization in Belarus, and it was exactly in the moment when Arab revolution started. So the international context and the context of European policy was a very, very enabling to think of doing something new. And by European standards, it was not easy. It took us 2 years to develop idea and to convince many players, especially biggest European players. Some of them, although they join hands, still are reluctant with funding. So it is an interesting phase of the whole process to set up. But true is that endowment now is fully operational. We already made the first funding decisions. We have decent, not a big, but a decent budget for next 2.5 years. And we have a very clear mandate. So the endowment is built to provide a quick help to fill existing gaps, not to solve all the problems that exist in the democracy support from the European nations. Where we are trying to take best inspiration from that, and where we will be trying to build our own methodology, it is yet to be clearly seen, because we are still in the process of developing our operational model. One thing I can say, that endowment, although formally existing as an NGO, was created as a result of member states' cooperation with the European institutions. So that's a very unique and also very challenging setup when we have an institution that is governed like an international organization, but tries to pretend to be an NGO and tries to build an image of really being independent. And this is the promise we made when the endowment was created. This challenge will accompany us at least during first 3 years, and this is something that I personally see as one of the biggest challenge if I look into months and years to come. How to really be independent and at the same time to satisfy expectations of main donors of this initiative and the governing powers. But let me maybe for a moment answer some of your, or answer or debate some of questions you asked. Because Endowment is really new institution, and we are going to talk more about it when we have first good or bad results of its activities. But Endowment is built in a specific context of international debate on democracy support. And as you rightly said, I have a personal experience being supported as a very young activist. At that time, 81, I was running small publishing house underground until 81 to 83. And it was based on support from external actors. We were receiving from Sweden and Denmark the printing materials. They were reaching me in different forms. Sometimes I was receiving one small Xerox machine that was coming in pieces out of 5 people, because, of course, they were afraid to smuggle this to Poland. So everybody was taking care of some small part. The problem was when one part was missing. So we were not able to reassemble this machine to really start printing. So several times we had a beautiful, ready machine with a smell of freedom. You may not know what it is, but the smell of freedom is a smell of this plastic and this all fresh technology coming from abroad. And I remember till today this, but still the machine was not operating. So we were almost crying like, we want to print, but something is missing. So this is the experience of external actor support as I am carrying in my personal life experience. And I must say that for us, that time, it was something we couldn't imagine that we can do without support what we've done. But at the same time, we were never thinking in a way that this is something that is obligatory. I mean, that we have to have it. We were still looking into any kind of international support, like this is a gift, this is a kind of extended hand, but we should do ourselves. So in a sense, we may use it, we may not use it, it may come, it may not come, but the mission is there. In a sense, we cannot count on it if we think of the future. So this being said, I want to address one issue that is definitely often coming to the discussion today. How to make distinction between indigenous drive for democracy, indigenous actual effort, and sometimes group of professionals who are already well understanding international mechanisms, and they know how to use international money actually for their private benefits, not necessarily to build democracy in their country. And this phenomenon already exists. It has even name in Russian, grantoyedy. So the eaters of grants. Yeah, everybody understands this. And that is for me, as now being one of a member of the donor community, is an extremely important question. Every decision we will make, every decision I will recommend to the decision-making body, I have to think this through. And that is an important part of the big puzzle that we call democracy support. Second, I am hearing more and more comments from Arab world and different parts of the world that democracy support is suspicious. It is something that interferes into internal affairs. And here, whenever I come to talk to people, I say, I don't understand what you're saying. Because I never, in any stage of our transition in Poland, whether it was 80s or when I was already in the foreign ministry trying to build a capacity of my country, new capacity to govern one or another part of administration, I never saw international assistance as an interference. So I try to understand what is rationale behind this comment. And there must be one. So we cannot neglect. There is a new sensitivity we have to address. With my Arab colleagues, I always was trying to switch discussions from talking about democracy to talking about something else, because they sometimes perceive democracy as an external product. This is something you'd want to export to us. No, we don't want to export. Are you trying to manage best your life? Yes. Do you want to decide? Yes. Do you want to be respected and to give respect to others? Yes. This is democracy. You want me to support you? Well, I would like to hear your story. I would like to have maybe some help. Then we are on the same page. If discussion goes beyond a simple terminology, then suddenly things are much more easier. So these are the experience that I am trying to bring to the work of Endowment. And as I said, Endowment is just starting its cruise speed operations. We have made a lot of promises. This is going to be flexible, quick mechanism. This is the copy from net. 12 weeks to send information whether a grant is provided or not. Providing grants to non-registered NGOs. This is something that we also are trying to fill existing gaps. Providing grants for core institutional funding, not necessarily always project-based financing. Again, a strong demand from both East and South neighborhood, as our geographic mandate is just a European neighborhood. So we are not yet going global. I will answer some more questions later on, but sorry for a bit prolonged intervention.
Thank you very much. This story about the printing machine from Denmark reminds me that we had exactly the same experience in the Czech underground.
You've got the fifth part.
Maybe. But, and that's why I'm talking about, there was something more important before, and that was a transfer of know-how from Polish Solidarność to the Czech underground movement. And this transfer of know-how meant that we had learned how to construct the homemade printing machine. So thus, the equipment which came, it was a high-tech equipment, a high-tech of the late 80s, not of the today's time. If it didn't work, we still were able to print because we were able to construct the homemade printing machine. And it reminds me that this is important, it's to assist somebody in a way that the target of the assistant is able to develop this further and to do this on his own, not to be dependent on just on the foreign assistance. Kenneth Wollack is the third speaker today. Again, we know each other since the late 80s or early 90s when I guess was coming to Prague as a part of NDI delegation with Madeleine Albright. He is a long-time president of National Democratic Institute. I'm a Republican, so I'm communicating also with IRI, it's this Mirror Foundation International Republican Institute, but I have to say only nice words about Ken, because his work in democracy promotion globally, his leadership, his common work with Madeleine Albright, it's something what I really admire and have to thank because you were here among the first in early 90s. Your role is a little bit different from NED. Your role is to help, to assist in building this post-change environment, thus attempting, this fragmented society to put into some elementary order in a way that all those important reforms must go through, and it requires politics, in a way, the policy making, not in a way just the politics for the politics, because that's the way to nowhere. So, what is your experience and what are your recommendations, Ken?
Well, thank you very much, Sasha. I think one way to understand the difference between the NED and NDI and the other institutes that are affiliated with the endowment is the NED and the European Endowment are grant-making organizations. And we, as institutes of the endowment, are operational. We are on the ground. We provide some grants, but mostly technical assistance. We operate in 65 countries now with staff representing about 96 nationalities. And the endowment family is an important part of our work and important, central to our personality. When you began, Sasha, you talked a little bit about interventionism, and you did as well, Jerzy. I'm reminded of a speech in 1989 by the then president of Venezuela, Carlos Andres Perez, following a stolen election in Panama by General Noriega. And at a meeting of the Organization of American States, which had a non-intervention clause in its charter, President Carlos Andres Perez, known as CAP, gave a stinging condemnation of the non-intervention clause of the OAS Charter, saying that non-intervention is a form of intervention on behalf of non-democratic forces. And the speech was so powerful that it led to a change of the OAS Charter, what became known as the Santiago Declaration. But it was a stark reminder that what we do is intervention, I believe, in the best sense of the word. We stand behind people, not in front of them. We support peaceful change, and we support what I believe and what we believe, and every poll in the world shows the hopes and aspirations of people in every region of the world. Now, all of us who believe or are engaged in democratic solidarity and democratic intervention find ourselves in challenging environments both at home and abroad. At home, our financial situations, the legacy of the Iraq War, and Sasha, some of my best friends are Republicans, and matter of fact, I go from here to Dallas because I'm on the advisory board of the Bush Institute, perhaps the token Democrat on the advisory board. But there is the legacy of the Iraq War and seeming violence and chaos in the aftermath of the Arab Spring have raised questions in some quarters about the efficacy of international engagement and democratic transitions more broadly. And this, there is a tendency to overlook the more positive democratic trajectories in places like Tunisia, Yemen, and I would even argue Libya. It also tends to overlook the human toll and the human suffering that has taken place over decades in the Arab world, and human toll as the result of inter-Arab and intra-Arab conflicts. A little historical note in this part of the world, we tend to overlook that in the decade following the fall of the Berlin Wall, you had Milosevic and Mečiar in power and a war raging in Yugoslavia. So although patience is not a great American virtue, I think in this case, when it comes to transitions in the Arab world, we have to have a little patience. The other challenges we face are challenges from abroad. And we are now, I think, facing two phenomena. And while the global democracy trends have been overwhelmingly positive over the past 3 decades, the anti-democratic camp of autocratic leaders regrouped and found new confidence. They became more fearful of change and more assertive. Moreover, these autocrats were communicating with and learning from each other. Through intimidation, the adoption of new laws, or sophisticated propaganda, these leaders have acted to suppress journalists, independent civic groups, and political rivals, real or perceived. These autocracies operated alongside increasingly resilient semi-authoritarian states in which strong centralization of power is hidden behind a quasi-democratic facade. Elections, civil society, the press, and opposition parties are tolerated but tightly controlled. Now, these autocratic and semi-authoritarian states are also engaged in a more concerted campaign against outside assistance as well. In addition to the deepening of authoritarian rule, the second phenomenon is that new democracies are struggling to meet voters' expectations, particularly with regard to improving standards of living. This situation has raised citizens' discontent, not with democracy itself, but with their elected leaders and the performance of their newly established democratic institutions. Many who were caught up in the euphoria of democracy's third wave assumed that democratic rule would encourage the development and delivery of policies that reflected the popular will and addressed the social and economic issues that affect citizens' daily lives. Often, however, new democratic regimes have inherited the legacies of its non-democratic predecessors, which includes poverty, disease, corruption, and disaffected citizenry. Perhaps we were overly optimistic about the linear nature of democracy. I remember Bronislaw Geremek warned that democracy does not necessarily go from triumph to triumph. We are facing a new challenge around the world, too, and that is with technology. And while technology, in a very positive way, has empowered citizens to voice their demand, to voice their concerns, often in a very disaggregated way, political institutions have been slow to respond. They have often, citizens utilizing 21st century technology, often government and political institutions are listening with 20th century technology and responding using 19th century technology. Now, in noting the accomplishments achieved along with the long-term challenges inherent in democratic transitions, a few thoughts occur to me on what's been done right and what's been done wrong. First, on the positive front, from my perspective, we stay. Regardless of how easy or hard the transition path, we understand the long-term generational nature of the change required to establish a democratic system. Change that is political, institutional, legal, social, and not least behavioral. My organizations and others like us set up offices in countries. We tend to build and develop relationships and have centered our assistance around real-life concerns and aspirations of our partners. These relationships lie at the heart of all of our efforts. Second, the fact that support to political parties, civil society groups, media, and parliaments has been largely done by non-governmental organizations and not directly by government agencies cannot be overemphasized. Helping to build democracy at a fundamental level has been about creating a vision of pluralism and political engagement that does not require state sanction. So it is fitting that our governments, and hopefully the European governments, will stand behind and not in front of these assistance efforts. Third, international partnerships are critical because democratic progress is ultimately inseparable from democratic cooperation. At the diplomatic, political, assistance levels, these relationships must be strong, dynamic, and effective in fostering overlapping paths. And NDI has seen this partnership work with our engagement with a host of other governments, multilateral institutions, non-governmental organizations at the regional level and the international level, the European party groups, the political internationals, the party foundations in Germany, Sweden, and elsewhere, and intergovernmental organizations such as the OSCE, even the African Union, and the OAS. Now, while most of the partners with whom we work value their American connections, they were naturally and understandably drawn to other groups and institutions. And these international approaches have practical, political, and financial value. Fourth, and I'll leave it at that, we perhaps overestimated the power of elections and the need for breakthroughs, and underestimated the need to keep focused on politics after ballots were counted, and also the need for greater cooperation, if not integration, with the traditional economic development community, because we have found, not surprisingly, that economic and political reform, economic and political development now go hand in hand. And these two communities have tended to operate in isolation from each other. We have a lot to learn, and they have a lot to learn. And this is something which I think is one of the new challenges for democracy going forward. Finally, I just want to say a new challenge, given what I described as authoritarian learning, is how we better deliver this type of assistance in places where we cannot operate inside. Offshore programs in places now like Russia, like Cuba, like Belarus, Venezuela, Ethiopia, and I can go on and on. So the combination of grant making and technical assistance now in these places have to be done completely offshore or partly offshore because of political environments that have been closed. And with that.
Thank you, Ken. The last speaker at the panel is Suat KINIKLIOⴷLU. I hope my pronunciation is fine. Suat is right now is executive director of Stratim, so Center for Strategic Communication. I have read on the internet that you are also the regular columnist to the Turkish newspapers called Zeman, so don't mistake this with the Czech president. But we know each other, quite a long time. I remember we first met somewhere after 2001 when we were working both for the German Marshall Fund, and it was a part of certain reflection of the world after 9/11, when Ron Asmus, later our longtime friend, unfortunately he's not here anymore, was managing the Brussels office of GMF, and he, as well as all of us, were convinced that we should diversify our attention. All the 1990s, we were so much focused on the development in Central and Eastern Europe, but after 9/11, it was pretty clear that we should also focus much more on the Middle East. So Suat, that time, joined us as a well-established expert from Turkey. And I remember that his insight was very, very valuable at that time. Since that, time has passed. You had a briefly incident with the Turkish politics for 4 years, the member of the parliament. Now, just Suat told me how it's difficult to run through the partisan primaries. So he's back with the NGO. But a lot has changed since that. Ken has told that probably we were too over-optimistic, that we should also find the right balance between this pro-democracy assistance and the economic and development aid and assistance. We have moved this pro-democratic community, since this great hope related with the emergence of what was called the Arab Spring. Now, 2-3 years after, the skeptics are talking about the Arab autumn or fall. You are, I think, the right man to enlighten us where we are with the agenda right now.
Thanks, Sasha. I'm not sure whether I will be able to enlighten you, but a lot of good things have been said already by my Polish colleague Ken and Barbara. I think I will be just adding to some of it as someone who worked at a grant-making organization, has been in politics, and now is a think tanker. First of all, I think it probably is relevant to put out first what I think, and it's in one respect, in addition to what Ken said. I don't think we should doubt ever whether we should do this work or not. We live in a world where there is a strong battle of ideas, where there is a strong conflict between values in different parts of the world. I live in a country where I daily live this. We have such a divided society on identity, on how our country should, what kind of foreign policy identity we should have, how we should live ourselves, whether one can wear a mini skirt or not, or whether one should consume alcohol or not, or how much religion in public life is visible, should be visible, etc. So I think the battle for values will continue, and I think the men and women who are involved in this are people I think we should be all paying great respect to, because it is an ongoing and sometimes very ungrateful, frustrating business, because I think one of the speakers said sometimes short-term outcomes might not be really giving you the real picture. These are more long-term battles to be won. And I think in that respect, there are many countries now on this globe where elections take place. And OSCE observers manage to produce somewhat acceptable or somewhat critical reports. But it doesn't help the men and women who aspire for better lives, for good governance, for democracy. I mean, I think Ken said, authoritarian governments have become smarter about how to combat with NGOs, progressive elites, columnists, and also the international game of measuring elections. And how I think you alluded to the fact that there are genuine NGOs, there are men and women who risk their lives to battle in their countries, but then there are others who take this as a professional business and make a living out of it. I think it's not always easy to differentiate, but it's certainly an important task, and I hope your new endowment will be able to manage that. What I really would like to, might have some added value to this audience is because where I come from, and actually the Arab awakening, as I used to call it, but no longer awakening, I think is really the right word, is very close to where I live. I mean, we have 910 kilometers of a border with a country called Syria. Now close to 500,000 refugees in our country. And we feel the direct impact of these events physically, including physical security on our borders. Democracy assistance, I think, in our part of the world, and more so in the Middle East, Turkey obviously is not an Arab country, but is generally seen as something suspicious. The fact that the funding comes from an external country is easily entertained within a conspiratorial framework. The men and women who receive those fundings could be easily identified as agents, as all kinds of things, as enemy of the state, and etc. We all know that. And I think in that respect, there is a great responsibility on grant makers and also of their local branches and of the staff of those grant-making organizations to be really imaginative and finding appropriate ways and mechanisms, but also make an extra effort in these domestic contexts not to be seen or not allow others to exploit the work that they're doing, because this is a great risk. There is, I mean, this is something, this is a fact of life. There is great paranoia in many countries about external assistance, whether it comes from Russia or from the United States or from the European Union or others. And one reason for that is, I think we need to be honest about that to ourselves, is the inconsistency of these many national governments where from these fundings are coming from. I mean, if you live in Turkey, many people have a difficulty in understanding why there is not an intervention in Syria, while there was an intervention in Iraq. And many Turks would say there was no need for an intervention in Iraq, while there's a need now in Syria, but it's not happening. And we see millions of people who've had tragic changes to their lives. We have, as I said, close to 500,000 of them. So then, if you are a progressive elite in a country like Turkey, you get confronted with this question. You know, if democracy promotion is so valuable and correct and ethical, why do these governments not do this and that? So there's always a consistency issue. Of course, we all do know foreign governments, all governments, do not act only on values. They act on national interests. When values match national interests, it's a great combination. When they don't, there's a problem. And the fact is, I'm not going to name countries yet, there are many authoritarian countries in our neighborhood with whom the European Union and many other countries do business. Some of them have energy, some of them have gas, some of them have this and that. And this is a fact of life. But I think there is a challenge for grant makers and also for those who receive grants to explain their cases in domestic contexts when they are confronted with these inconsistencies. Why does the United States does not interfere in country X, where there is a grave democracy deficit, for instance? So this is something that is, I think, we, and maybe perhaps many in this room, are grappling with. But this should not deter or shy us from continuing from the good work. I think we will not see the end of it. Maybe perhaps our kids will not see it either. But I think we are in for a long struggle about values on this globe. I mean, when Huntington wrote his piece, we all shunned him. But today, I think he had many valid points. And I think today, it's about culture, it's about values. And the values that most people in this room are upholding are ones worth fighting for. Democracy, transparency, good governance, human rights. How do we live with others who do not necessarily live like us? Secularism, the role of religion in public life. These are things which will be defining the future of our globe. And I'm sometimes in my pessimistic modes. I think people will be more associating across national borders depending on how they live, rather than what passport they carry. Because we live now in societies where we may carry the same passport, we have totally different notions about how we should be raising our kids or what kind of political order there should be in our country. So let me just stop by, I'm not the expert that from NED or NDI or from the European, what was the name? Endowment, sorry. But I'm maybe sometimes I'm someone from the field and also who was on the other side in government. Let me just conclude that I truly believe in the good work, in the worth and value and the effort that many young, brave men and women give for these assistances. And of course, as our Polish colleague eloquently underlined, it's a great challenge to identify the right partners who do the right work within very diverse domestic contexts. And I hope God is helping them in their work.
Yes, Ken, the reaction is yours.
Because people talk, and I think it's fair to say that there are high-profile cases in which governments react to outside assistance, or certain leaders react to outside assistance. And usually it's the same leaders that react to domestic organizations, too, wanting to engage constructively in the political process. And in a sense, they can't separate the two. But I just did a list of offices that we have in the Middle East: Morocco, Lebanon, Jordan, Yemen, Palestine, Iraq, Mauritania, Libya. And in all of these places, there has never been a controversy over our work. We had our recent board meeting in Jordan. In a meeting with the Prime Minister, he said he'd been in office for 8 months. He's met with our representative 5 times already. We work with all the parties in Jordan. We work with civic groups. We work with parliamentarians. And operating the way Suat talked about, even in places like Yemen, where we've been involved in negotiations between the then ruling party and the opposition, at the request of both sides, engaged in the national dialogue with the youth, with the parties, with civil society, with women. If you handle this work with humility, if you're able to communicate, and if you operate in a multi-partisan or non-partisan way, you can overcome those suspicions. And in many of the countries that we're all working in, these are new democracies where there is a general consensus among government, parties, parliament, between civil society, of wanting to move forward to build or rebuild certain institutions. And in those situations, they welcome outside engagement because it helps contribute to their learning curve, to learn from some of the successes and the failures of political transitions elsewhere. So I just don't...
Where you have the office in Libya, in Tripolis or Benghazi?
Both.
Both?
Both. With a very large staff in both places. And this assistance has been welcomed by the parties and by civil society and by the government as well.
Yeah.
Just one comment that we need to add to this discussion about external actors, because somehow we are forgetting that there are also, and it was mentioned, but it was quickly bypassed. They are actors, they are working against democracy, and they are external. And when we see now over last few months and years how Russia actively is diverting attention of societies from joining European Union or joining European standards instead of joining customs union, this is an active actor with a very specific agenda, targeting specific values, consolidating specific understandings in those societies of values, saying that Europe is not the right direction for you. We have another offer for you. China is equally active. China providing software that allows controlling society, censoring internet. So here we have external actors as well. So let's talk about all group of the external actors that are involved in supporting either democracy or anti-democracy.
Yeah, may I just...
Yeah, Barbara, what's about, you and Chinese in Africa? Who
Ned
is
and
winning?
Chinese. Okay.
They have more money.
Well, before I comment on the other kinds of external actors, although I think correctly, there was a statement made earlier about the autocrats are sharing tactics and strategies. They're even, I think, looking very specifically at the tools of traditional democracy assistance organizations and trying to emulate them, but with different content and different goals. I think that, despite, I of course agree with Ken, and NED funds programs in probably close to 90 countries at any given time. Our funding goes both to what we call our core institutes, such as NDI. So they're operating organizations with very special kinds of expertise, but also relationships in international and regional sort of architecture. So Ken mentioned the party internationals and so on, where they can really leverage a lot of what they're doing with many, many other countries through their parallel institutions. But we also fund very local groups, independent media, human rights, all sorts of civic groups, think tanks, analytical groups. And therefore, NED is very hard to simply push out of a country by regime because we're not there physically. So we are not subjected to pressure for terms of being in a country by a government whose laws may be, let's say, imposed in ways that are not based on some due process. We are simply obliged to follow our own laws in what we do, and that's what we do. So it makes an interesting partnership, and I think potential agility between the on-the-ground groups such as NDI and the kind of grant making that we can do that reaches the local groups with the sort of operating support that Jerzy was pointing to, rather than just project by project. So that is, in fact, one of the key reasons why NED exists, and I think why the Europeans wanted a similar, it will take on its own character, but a similar sort of setup, but also because not only are organizations who have to operate on the ground, who are from abroad, potentially subject to an awful lot of coercion or restriction and so on, and they have extremely difficult choices to make as to whether to call it quits because the terms are unacceptable, or whether to keep that little space that they are still able to provide for some of the local players. But in the end, it's very easy for governments or entrenched interests and powers or outside players who are not interested in any sort of democratic reform to sort of whip up what may be some underlying grievances in societies. Some sense of, it's easy to tap this issue of sovereignty. It's easy to whip up sensitivities based on kind of imperialism, of religious or cultural imperialism, or disrespect for their local beliefs, or even to whip up people against each other within the society, to fearmonger, to make an excuse for stronger security environment, which can totally derail a transition and sometimes makes it worse than where it started out. But it all leads to a question that was mentioned earlier, or a comment that was mentioned earlier by Jerzy, which is, or maybe by Sasha, which is, who does what best? What are the instruments that we have? What are they best equipped to do? And I think that, and Ken isn't always going to agree with me on this, but I think in some ways will. In general, I would say that where there are true interests in governing institutions in the transitioning country, or wannabe transitioning country, to change and reform their institutions and to open up the system, it is the most hospitable territory for government assistance from other countries. And government assistance tends to be, it really is essential for, I think, large institutional reforms. Small organizations such as the European Endowment or NED cannot cope with that, and in fact, we're not there to give government assistance. We're there to give non-governmental assistance to non-governmental groups in the private sector. But we are not tied to direct policy, day-to-day foreign policy, and it's and our funding doesn't come out of some decision-making in the State Department. It comes out of the decision-making of our own boards, and they are totally private. They're not appointed by government. And we're single mission. So we didn't start programs in Egypt with the uprisings. We didn't start democracy programs with that. We started in 1993, 1994, throughout the Middle East, and NDI got started in those years as well. So we have a longer history, I think, until the US government came in a big way. I think we had a lot more space and credibility. But then when there was a major machine going after the US government support and what its motivations were and so on, it was really ugly. We all got wrapped up in it. We all got swept up in it. It was painted with a broad brush. And this is very problematic. I'm not sure it could have been avoided, but I think this is one of the phenomenon that we really, really, really have to step back and grapple with and think about. And the other thing is when the US government is sending in a lot of contractors who are spreading around a lot of money and really they'll take any mission that is assigned to them, and their job is to implement their work plans. And local actors are tools for implementing those work plans. So I think there needs to be a shift, particularly in this political development field, away from that kind of assistance.
Suat, you wanted to add?
Yeah. I just wanted to, something I forgot. I think the ongoing, especially in the Middle East, the ongoing debate will be between majoritarianism versus pluralism. And that's something that needs to be watched. I don't know how your organizations are positioning themselves in that respect. But I mean, Egypt is the most striking example. You know, you have a party that wins the election, but there is great discomfort based on identity, pluralism, not being able to embrace other sectors of society. So I think part of the work that probably will become more visible will be what democracy means. What does it mean? Is it only winning an election, and can you do whatever you like in the next 4 to 5 years? Or what other components of democracy need to be respected so that it can be qualified as a democracy?
Jerzy?
One comment I want to add, because I listened to Barbara with a great interest, and your last words are words of wisdom. It's really something that we have to keep in mind. And that what I also meant when I was saying that the biggest challenges for me will be to satisfy or not the governments that are paying me. And lucky part of it that there are many. So if there are many bosses, you can tackle sometimes swimming in between. So that's the strategy I am trying to implement. But please don't tell them. But what I want to say, every conference should provide some recommendations, some kind of result of discussion. I would like to say here that I was, of course, for some time carefully looking into US-EU relations, and I discovered that US-EU talks about trade, talks about money laundering, counter-terrorism, talks about sanitary issues, about almost everything, including even human rights. But there is no structural dialogue on democracy support between EU and US. I think something is missing. This is the biggest community of the certain values, as you rightly said. And why there is no formal coordination mechanism on this? So I think this could be one of the recommendations from our discussion, that maybe there is also need for the more coordination and more real exchanges in order to, first of all, correct different operational models. Secondly, discuss priorities, and thirdly, react to those situations when the reaction is needed, not when they appear, as rightly again Barbara said, but the years before.
Yeah, very accurate observation. So we do have 15 minutes, so I think it's the time for the audience. So I saw the first hand here, then on the left. Is there an assistance with the microphone, or should I? Here. And please introduce yourself.
My name is Hernán Alberro. I'm Programs Director of CADAL, the Center for the Opening and Development of Latin America from Argentina, Buenos Aires. I found your presentations really interesting. I just want to stress out one thing regarding the last part of the conversation between Barbara and Mr. Pomianowski, which is basically that those working against democracy, let's say from abroad, as Pomianowski mentioned, tend to stay for a long time on power, and so they have long-term policies, so it's even tougher from our organizations and I guess your organizations in democracies with government changes and strategy changes and everything to deal with that. I mean, I can tell you that our experience working with democracy in Cuba, and we've seen many ministries of foreign affairs, ministers of foreign affairs changes in Argentina during the last 20 years, and though there has been changes in Cuba, the decision-making process is still the same, and the person taking decisions is always the same. So they have a clear strategy, and they do meet one another, and so that's I think something to stress out. And the other one regarding the Syria and other cases that Suat mentioned is that what I think is that if we all work together, and I'm including the governments, the democratic governments in all the world, promoting democracy in an honest way, then we wouldn't have to discuss if to intervene, military intervention or no, in a country where democracy doesn't exist. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. So now,
hello, I'm Marianka Kukuyumiko, and I have several comments to make. Yesterday I stopped at a wonderful, powerful statue on Újezd with victims to communism, and I took some numbers in there. It's, among other things, those who were killed at the border crossings and so on and so forth. There is 170,000, almost 180,000 people who emigrated in since 1948. Now, I'm one of the people who is still there. In 1968, I was 24. Now I live partly in Hawaii and partly in Canada. I miss Prague very much. I would not have chosen to do this, but I'm still there. My life is there. And it was very easy to know what was what in 1968, at least for all of us. I hope it was also clear for the world, but nothing happened because of Stalin, Churchill, Yalta Agreement. We were simply the Soviet zone, and that was that. What I find more difficult is to read the situation now in Syria. Maybe I'm not the only one.
You're not the only one.
And so here, most of us rightly expected some help from the mighty West, and the West was scratching its head, like in the Z movie. But short of figuring it out somehow, I think your suggestion of improving or increasing, one of the suggestions I would have is to have some organized program to follow. Excuse me, I can't stand up. Programs such as Democracy Now!, which I think is an excellent program. Would you agree with me? And perhaps even to some degree, as it happens from Canada. The program Democracy Now! Truly is on a ball. I think it's well researched, and there's no reason why other countries couldn't, in very specific way, be getting active information from it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. You?
Hi, I'm Matthew Kwazaborski with the Fund for American Studies based here in Prague. I have some questions for you. As external actors, you monitor what's going on in different parts of the world, and here in a lot of the media attention's obviously on Syria and the Middle East. But right here in the European backyard, my question would be about Belarus. Do you think Belarus will actually become openly democratic in the next couple of years, or is it securely on the path of North Korea where the son will inherit Lukashenko? Secondly, you also have the rise of, I would say, pro-nationalist parties in Greece with the Golden Dawn, Jobbik in Hungary. And also here, kind of in the Czech Republic, the communists are sort of kind of making a comeback. And the way they're sort of making a comeback is being democratically elected. Is there anything sort of on the back burner that if these sort of parties that are not purely democratic in nature start to gain more and more influence and power, that there is some sort of way to externally influence if this really does happen in Hungary, Greece, and the Czech Republic? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you...
Krzysztof Stanowski, Solidarity Fund PL, Polish Democracy Support Agency. In 2000, UN Millennium Declaration included the 5th chapter, the chapter about human rights, democracy, and rule of law. Unfortunately, Millennium Development Goals excluded this area. Somehow, my first question is, do we need or should we use kind of international documents we got, like Millennium Declaration, to explain why democratic governments are involved supporting civil society abroad, not only internationally. How it happened that it was lost, and what we can do today to ensure that this is the part of the debate. On the other hand, what we can do as international community to ensure that development cooperation brought to our friends from our countries by democratic countries will include the element of empowerment, will guarantee that when democratic government is providing international assistance, it's empowering citizens in this country. What we can do about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last hand is, see here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Lucia Gregurkova. I'm a student of international relations here in Prague. But I would like to ask about one external actor, which is very important nowadays, and this is the UN. I would like to ask you, what do you think about the role of the UN right now in the crisis in Syria or a crisis in Mali? And if you want to respond to another question, what do you think about the missions? And what do you think of the new form of missions where everything is included in one mission? I mean, post-conflict restriction and peacekeeping, peace building, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we do have 7 minutes to go. So here, how it will handle the conclusion of the panel. There are 4 questions. I registered, there were 2 comments, but 4 questions. One question was about Belarus, so that I would ask our Polish colleague, because they are best qualified, you know, to know the territory between us and Russia. Who is gonna
guilty as charged
to win Belarus, us or the Russians?
Yes, guilty as charged. Of course, we believe we are most qualified to talk about Belarus, but this is not true, of course. In 2006, if you ask the very same questions, I would answer, well, by 2010, 2011, the Belarus is a democratic country and is going soon to join European Union. If you ask this question today, I will answer within 5 years the Belarus is a democratic country and will join the European Union. I may be as mistaken as I was in 2006. But that's what we believe in. That's what the dream is about. So it's very difficult to say what really will happen. But honestly, the biggest problem is not the Lukashenko. The biggest problem is the 60% of the population in Belarus that only thinks not to make situation worse than it is now. And that is the biggest challenge for every democracy fighter, for every democracy promoter, I mean the in-country, the people who are trying to convince them. And just in order to defend the Belarusian society, I want to quote one of the recent survey polls I was reading about Poland, that in Poland we still, the country of solidarity, we have a 40% of the people who has no specific attachment to democracy, and then when asked directly in the survey whether you would accept authoritarian leadership, they said, well, no problem with this, 40%. So only tiny majority of so-called pro-democracy, if we take half-half, yeah, the 40 to 60% of population that believes that democracy is something good, needed, and they aspire for. So that's a huge piece of work for all of us.
Thank you very much, Ken. You will get the hardest question to answer. You will not escape me. Well, somebody here must answer the question about the communists in Czech Republic, and
the nationalists, or the communists.
It was about the communists. There are still
right.
That's. And time to time we had to answer here the questions from our domestic audience, whether we have made a mistake, that we did not abolish the communists, that did not ban the Communist Party like Romanians, for example, did immediately in the beginning of 1990. I know it's a hard question.
Well, the Poles didn't.
But tell us your view. Did we make a mistake or not?
No, I mean, the Poles didn't either, and you had changes of government. The question, you can ask these questions, and I don't know if there is a right answer. You can ask questions about what do you do with human rights violations of previous regimes too, and every society. Every democratic society has to determine whether there's going to be amnesty or whether there's going to be truth commissions or whether there's going to be convictions. I rather put those issues before democratic governments to determine whether, in their view, more inclusionary policies, a willingness to provide a system as long as people play by the rules of the game. And I happen to believe that rather than some grand reformation, and this is true in the Middle East, some grand reformation, the practice of democracy, I believe, over time, is a moderating force. I think most people in these countries are somewhere in the middle. And the best way to isolate the extremes is through the practice of democracy. And so I side with the inclusionary, as long as people don't advocate violence and are willing to play by the rules of the game. I take a very different view of Hamas on the West Bank than I do the Brotherhood in Egypt before their participation, or Hezbollah in Lebanon. I'll make one last point, and it has to do with our Argentine friend about governments not always acting like human rights organizations. I've become relatively philosophical about these issues. I wish we could all act as consistently as the Czechs do. But if you look at the evolution of the United States over the last 30 years on this issue, there is not an ambassador at an embassy in the world that doesn't have democracy as part of his or her portfolio. It is now part of the work of diplomats. However, if you look at the United States posture around the world, whether it came with Pakistan with Musharraf or the Saudis, there are times when countries will place their short-term, or what they consider to be their short-term security interests, before issues that we care about. That's the nature of it. And the issue of assistance, whether it empowers citizens, it's a huge debate in the development community. You know, when I talked about the need for the democracy groups and the economic development groups to come together, the issue is, what is the goal of economic development? The Swedes define poverty both in political terms and social economic terms. And so the question that I have for the economic development community is first and foremost, do no harm, do no democratic harm. And so don't utilize economic assistance in a way that undermines human rights and democracies and empowers regimes that are highly undemocratic and can benefit politically from the assistance. So these are, I think, are all interesting, but we fight on these issues. Hopefully on the agenda of bilateral relations, we can help, help the democracy and human rights agenda to be higher up on the bilateral agenda, but it's not always going to be number 1 or number 2 or number 3. It's just the political reality of how states have to deal with each other.
Thank you. Barbara, Millennium Goal, is this just the paperwork which complicates and diverts the attention from the more important issues?
I think actually it relates a little bit to the discussion that Ken was just entering into about international organizations and norms. And Krzysztof was raising it, I think, in the context of international norms. And it is true, Krzysztof, that many of these countries that have a strong state, a centralized state, where the state takes precedent over the people, have in some of their tactics in trying to corral and coerce and constrain and co-opt civil society, have basically said, we want to approve we'll let you get international funding, but not until you vet your project activities and proposals with us so that we can make sure that they are advancing our development goals and our development strategy. So it has become a tool in some cases for trying to co-opt and corral the work of independent groups. The good news is that what is happening on one front may be different than what's happening on another front, and I would argue that within the UN or even the OAS, where the OAS has a lot of governments in it that are not democratic. The UN has a lot of governments that are not democratic, and they are the boss. There was a struggle this last year over the Human Rights Commission that the ALBA countries were trying to really emasculate the commission. It failed. That's the good news. These are places where these issues are contested. They don't always come out where you want, in any given year, or the Security Council, when it comes to use of force, is always another question. But there is, within the Human Rights Council, a new special rapporteur. It's now 2 years old, or going on its 3rd year, for freedom of association and peaceful assembly. The person who is doing this, he's a Kenyan, is producing some really outstanding reports that taps into the norms that everybody's already approved, or most countries have already approved, and is crafting the arguments for local actors to use that says why your governments have already agreed to this in all these covenants that they've signed on to and so on. So I do think that pushing back on some of these curtailments of principles and norms by using the norms that everybody agreed to is a very helpful and useful strategy. And you just have to remember it's going to be contested for a long time, but at least it's argued out in these forums.
Thank you. So, and Syria remains Suat on you. Isn't the problem too many external actors and the UN is just mirroring the mess where we are?
Okay, I'll do this short. There's lunch ahead of us. So, the first thing that you as an international relations student probably have learned is that the United Nations is not an independent actor. It's a reflection of large powers in the Security Council and the rest of the international community. The fact is, on Syria, Russia and China see very differently. Russia is entertaining a principal course about global governance. The Chinese have a different agenda. There is an element of Resolution 1973 on Libya that made the Russians upset. They have a point, but it doesn't cover the fact that hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, 110,000 people have died. close to 7 million have been dislocated, 5 million inside, 2 million outside of the country. I think that there was a window of opportunity at the beginning of the conflict in the first year that a coalition of the willing could have solved this very quickly. But that opportunity has been lost. What many of us, including my government, could not foresee is that Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia would be so forcefully and consistently behind this regime. And now you know what just happened in the last 2 weeks or so. So Syria will continue to be a mess. I'm not sure whether something called Syria will exist in the future. I don't think that entity, and I probably say the same thing for Iraq, may not exist in the future. I think they might fall apart with different areas controlled by different governments or whatever you want to call them. There might be a long period of areas which would have no central control or local control. This is a serious threat for my country and many others. Large powers will resist that. They will resist it until the very end, but there might be a de facto situation where Syria, and hopefully not Iraq, but perhaps Iraq as well, might fall apart. It's going to continue to be a mess, and we will all be grappling with it for some time to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for you for coming, and have a nice lunch and